Welcome to Family Policy Matters, a weekly podcast and radio show produced by the North Carolina Family Policy Council. Hi, I'm John Rustin, president of NC Family, and each week on Family Policy Matters, we welcome experts and policy leaders to discuss topics that impact faith and family here in North Carolina. Our prayer is that this program will help encourage and equip you to be a voice of persuasion for family values in your community, state, and nation. And now here's the host of Family Policy Matters, Traci DeVette Griggs.
Welcome to Family Policy Matters. If you've watched American culture over the last decade, you've probably noticed it's no longer enough for many people to disagree with traditional Christian beliefs. Increasingly, our culture celebrates violating what previous generations considered sacred, from the redefinition of marriage and gender to the celebration of abortion, and even public mockery of Christianity itself. Why is this happening? Our guest today says the real issue isn't just that our culture has rejected God, it's that in rejecting God, we've also lost our understanding of what it even means to be human. Dr. Carl Trueman is professor of biblical and theological studies at Grove City College and one of today's leading Christian thinkers on culture and identity. His previous books include The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self and Strange New World. We have interviewed him about those, so you can search back in our old podcasts if you'd like to listen to that. His newest book, and the one we'll talk about today, is The Desecration of Man, How the Rejection of God Degrades Our Humanity. Dr. Trueman, welcome to Family Policy Matters.
Great to be here, Traci. Thanks for having me back.
All right. So in your book, you argue that when society desecrates God and what is sacred, we are actually desecrating, damaging, spoiling ourselves. How does that work?
Well, when you think from a Christian perspective, we believe ourselves to be made in the image of God. If we trash God, if we get rid of God, then there's a sense in which we're abolishing our own exceptionalism, our own status, our own humanity. So one cannot reject God without calling for a fundamental redefinition, and I would argue downgrading, of what it means to be human. And that's the paradox. In asserting our godlike status, we actually reduce ourselves to being less than we once were.
Does this go beyond what we have often heard as the secularization or post-Christian status of our culture?
Yes. Often when we think of secularization, our minds might go to something like the disenchantment thesis, the idea that modernity has led to a loss of the magical, enchanted nature of reality. And certainly that captures a lot of what is going on in the modern world. But I think it doesn't explain everything. Take, for example, the language that surrounds abortion. In the 1990s, the argument was that abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. I don't agree with that, but I can see what's being said there as, abortion is a bad thing, but unfortunately we have to do bad things sometimes. We need to do them as infrequently and as safely and as legally as we possibly can. That's a big difference from somebody wanting in 2024 to shout their abortion or wearing a baseball cap or a sweatshirt proclaiming the fact that they've had an abortion. A certain ecstatic delight being taken in the destruction that is abortion there, that is simply not the result of disenchantment, so to speak. The first, safe, legal, and rare, that's a disenchanted standpoint. The more modern, more recent standpoint, I would say, is captured much more by the term desecration.
Right. And I think when we see these examples, for those of us who are Christians, it's heartbreaking. What is the reason behind this?
Well, I think from a Christian perspective, one has to take human sinfulness. In the account in Genesis, when the serpent tempts Eve, what does he say to her? God doesn't want you to eat this fruit because he knows that if you eat it, you will be like him. You will be like God. This desire we have as fallen human beings to be like God propels us towards this breaking with the standards that God has set before us, breaking with the limits that being made in the image of God involves. And yet, as I mentioned a few moments ago, when we do that, we end up as less than we were. Again, think of the Genesis account. At Genesis 2, at the end of Genesis 2, we're told that the man and the woman were naked and they were not ashamed. As soon as sin enters the picture in Genesis 3, the man and the woman realize they're naked, they hide from each other and they hide from God. Shame kicks in. They become less than they were before.
Right. We mentioned marriage and gender. We mentioned abortion. What are some other issues that we see every day that this is having a huge impact on?
perhaps controversially at this point, think about things like in vitro fertilization and surrogacy. There's a sense in which they are the things where we are most godlike. Reproduction is the point in human activity where we are most like God, when we create new life. Think about IVF, think about surrogacy, changing that mysterious creative process into something we have control over. That, I would say, is a very good example of this godlike Promethean aspiration that we have. And notice, of course, the results of that have been, certainly in surrogacy, the objectification of women, and on the whole, the turning of children into consumer commodities. They've been reduced. The God rebellion, or the godlike aspirations in these areas, have led to children and women being less than they once were. It's a sort of paradigm of the desecration thesis. I mean, I certainly would not want to say that the parents of a child born by, say, in vitro fertilization love that child any less. That's not what I'm saying. But I do think that IVF carries with it certain eugenicist necessities. There's a certain screening of embryos that goes on. The spectre of designer babies is always lurking in the background. And the law, of course, has to treat children born by IVF, or women pregnant with a surrogate child, has to treat these children as pieces of property. And where the law goes, that can reshape the thinking of the culture as a whole. The moral imagination of the culture, I think, will tilt us all towards thinking of children as objects and as consumer commodities. And what impact that has on children, who knows? But I fear it will not be a good one.
And I'm not going to ask you today to draw us a conclusion on that, because we could have, a long discussion about this issue, but certainly to think maybe we need to give some more thought to this.
Yes, and of course, what's interesting, comparing abortion to, say, IVF, is if a couple want an abortion, that's a bad thing. They desire a bad thing. If a young infertile couple desire a child, they're desiring a good thing. It's not a sinful desire. And I think that's the Trojan horse, or the Achilles heel of the situation, where, pastors might be confronted with a couple in their office asking, can we have a child by IVF? And every fiber in that pastor's being is going to want to say yes, because he wants them to fulfill what is a very, very legitimate desire. The question, of course, is whether the ends justifies the means, and what the means do to the way we think about children. When we bring it down to concrete situations, this is a very tricky and sensitive subject and has to be handled with great pastoral care. But we cannot ignore the bigger social consequences of these particular procedures.
So much of what we hear when we listen to the culture is so black and white, right? We hear these crazy stories about IVF on one side, where you have a Chinese businessman that has 100 kids that are U.S. citizens through surrogates. And then on the other side, you've got, it's compassionate and it's good. So there's so much nuance here. And I love that in your book, you explore that nuance for us and help us to come up with some better ways of thinking about it.
Yes, I certainly think that when any pastors listening today, if they're faced with that IVF question in their office or study, they have to remember that this is not an abstract concept for the people they're talking to. This is real life, and the desire is very strong and a very good desire. The issue, though, then becomes, what are the alternatives that would allow one to fulfill that very legitimate desire in a way that does not fundamentally transform the way that society thinks about children?
You devote a considerable amount of attention to technology. Talk about these technologies and why you think they reveal so much about what our culture believes to be human.
One of the interesting things about technology is that technology has developed at a speed that far outstrips our ability to think morally and ethically about it. I think we see this perhaps most dramatically when you have the development of the A-bomb in the 1940s in the midst of the Second World War. Suddenly, human beings are able to develop technology that could wipe human beings off the face of the earth. And it's sort of impossible to think in those terms, to think morally about that. Well, we've reached a point now where technology moves so fast that by and large, I think morally, we pretty much as a society given up trying to think morally about our technology, and we've reduced pretty much every question that was once moral to a technological question. And I think that's one of the issues that we need to face, particularly as Christians today. And when you think about what it means to be human relative to that, well, I would say we're seeing dramatic transformation of that. We've always been a technological species. We've always had tools. The Industrial Revolution, for example, of the 19th century allowed us to do things things with our bodies that we could not have done before. We can move faster. Somebody who can press a button can drive a very heavy hammer they could never have lifted. But we're now in a new industrial or technological revolution where we're able to alter the very building blocks of human life. We can penetrate our genetic structures and alter them. And I think that raises a huge question of what does it mean to be human? And we see in some of the language that now surrounds the transhumanism and posthumanism, the language of shame, the language of, is humanity worth continuing? The language of eugenics that has re-emerged in recent years, all of these things point to that humanity is becoming a technical problem rather than a theological or moral phenomenon.
So many of these issues are political, but they are also biblical. I feel like pastors have a hard time knowing where is that line? How do I talk about this without having half my church leave? Do you have some advice for them?
On the whole, it's good for pastors not to preach party politics from the pulpit, telling people how to vote. When I was a pastor, I would never have done that, and I always prayed for whoever the civil magistrate happened to be, in accordance, of course, with biblical commands there. But I think what a lot of pastors need to realize is that the big political questions of our day are anthropological questions. We're no longer debating free market versus mixed economy. We're no longer debating tax rates, those kind of things that were the staple of politics in the 1970s. We're debating questions about what does it mean to be human, whether we're talking about sexuality, whether we're talking about gender, or whether we're talking about reproductive technologies. These things go to the question of what does it mean to be human. So I would say pastors need to address these questions, and they need to do it really, think of it not so much as politics as anthropology. Teach your people clearly what the Bible teaches about what it means to be human, and that will give them the tools to address or think through whatever the next craziness that the secular world throws at the people is.
Wow. Okay. Well, talk to regular people like me who may try to speak out and influence some of the public policy that surrounds these issues and are told, oh, you're just a Christian, you're trying to legislate the Bible. What kind of encouragement do you have for us? And is there hope of overcoming some of these problems?
Yeah, two things. One, I think that a lot of people have an intuitive understanding of what it means to be human, even if it's not particularly well worked out. So it's interesting that, think about the transgender question. I often said to friends, the most powerful thing on the transgender question was not an argument. It was the picture of Riley Gaines standing next to Leah Thomas. Leah Thomas towering over Riley Gaines on the medal podium. And the instinctive reaction of a lot of people was, that's unfair. And that kind of reaction gives me some hope that there are still some intuitions that a lot of people share about what it means to be human that connect to things like fairness and justice. So I wouldn't despair of the fact that, don't think that you have to be speaking to a Christian to find somebody that you can develop common ground with on policies. And secondly, I would argue for avoiding what I would call the modern temptation of the instantaneous. One of the things even Christians often miss about the spirit of this age is we want things done instantly. Well, actually, history shows that big changes are often developed and cemented over time. It takes 300 years for the early church to transform the Roman Empire. The work that people like you do today, maybe you won't see the fruit of it by this time next year. Maybe you won't see the fruit of it in your own lifetime. But maybe you've laid a foundation that somebody 100 years or 150 years from now can capitalize on and achieve something great. So I would say, realize that we're playing the long game here. The things we do today, we're not doing them to see results tomorrow, though hopefully we may do that. We're really laying foundations for future generations.
Wow. Thank you so much. We are out of time, but what a great way to end. And thank you for that hopeful word. Today, we have been talking to Dr. Carl Trueman, author of The Desecration of Man, How the Rejection of God Degrades Our Humanity. Thank you again for joining us today on Family Policy Matters.
Thank you so much for having me, Traci.
Thank you for listening to Family Policy Matters. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show and leave us a review. To learn more about NC Family and the work we do to promote and preserve faith and family in North Carolina, visit our website at ncfamily.org. That's ncfamily.org. And check us out on social media at NC Family Policy. Thanks, and may God bless you and your family.